Magic and Mystery in Tibet by Alexandra David-Neel. Chapter 2, continued. A few yards away, another hut was built, containing a small private room for Yongden and a lodging for our servants. In enlarging my hermitage, I was not altogether yielding to sybaritic tendencies. It would have been difficult for me to fetch water and fuel and to carry these burdens up to my cave. Yongden, who had just left school, was no more experienced than I at this kind of work. We could not do without servants to help us. Therefore, an ample supply of provision and a storehouse was indispensable, since we were facing a long winter during which we should remain completely isolated. Now these things seemed to me small difficulties, but at that time I was making my debut in the role of anchorite, and my son had not yet begun his apprenticeship as explorer. The days passed, winter came, spreading a coat of immaculate snow on the whole country, and as we had expected, blocking the valleys that led to the foot of our mountain. The Gomchen shut himself up for a long retreat. I did the same thing. My single daily meal was placed behind a curtain at the entrance of my hut. The boy who brought it and who later carried away the empty plates left in silence without having seen me. My life resembled that of the Carthusians, without the diversion which they may find in attendance at religious services. A bear appeared in search of food, and after its first feelings of astonishment and defiance were over, grew accustomed to coming and waiting for bread and other eatable things that were thrown to it. At last, toward the beginning of April, one of the boys noticed a black spot moving in the clearing beneath us and cried out, "A man!" just as early navigators must have cried, "Land ahead!" We were no longer blocked in. Letters arrived that had been written in Europe 5 months before. Then it was springtime in the cloudy Himalayas. 900 feet below my cave, rhododendrons blossomed. I climbed barren mountain tops. Long tramps led me to desolate valleys studded with translucent lakes. Solitude, solitude. Mind and senses develop their sensibility in this contemplative life, made up of continual observation and reflections. Does one become a visionary, or rather, is it not that one has been blind until then? A few miles farther north, beyond the last range of the Himalayas, which the clouds of the Indian monsoon cannot cross, the sun shone in the blue sky over the high Tibetan tableland. But there, the summer was rainy, cold, and short. In September, the tenacious snows already covered the neighboring heights, and soon our yearly imprisonment began again. What were the fruits of my long retreat? I should have found it difficult to explain, yet I learned a number of things. Apart from my study of the Tibetan language with the help of grammars, dictionaries, and talks with the Gomchen, I also read with him the lives of famous Tibetan mystics. He would often stop our reading to tell me about facts that he himself had witnessed, which were akin to the stories related in the books. He would describe people that he had known, repeating their conversations and telling me about their lives. Thus, while seated in his cabin or in mine, I visited the palaces of rich lamas, entered the hermitages of many an ascetic. I traveled along the roads, meeting curious people. I became, in that way, closely acquainted with Tibet, its inhabitants, their customs, and their thoughts. A precious science which was later on to stand me in good stead. I never let myself be taken in by the illusion that my anchorite's home might become my final harbor. Too many causes opposed any desire of staying there and laying down once and for all the burden of foolish ideas, routine cares, and duties to which, like other Westerners, I still fancied myself to be bound. I knew that the personality of the Gomchemna, I'm going to spell that word for you, Gomchenma. I knew that the personality of a Gomchemna, which I had taken on, could only be an episode in my life as a traveler, or at the best, a preparation for future liberation. Sadly, almost with terror, I often looked at the thread-like path which I saw lower down, winding in the valleys and disappearing between the mountains. The day would come when it would lead me back to the sorrowful world that existed beyond the distant hill ranges, and so thinking, an indescribable suffering lay hold of me. Besides more important reasons, the impossibility of keeping servants any longer in this desert compelled me to leave my hermitage. Yet, before parting once more from Tibet, I wished to visit one of its two great religious centers, Chigatse, which was not a great distance. And let me spell that for you. Shigatze, Shigatse, which was not a great distance. The famous monastery of Tashilhunpo, Tashilhunpo, lies near this town. It is the seat of the Grand Lama, whom foreigners call the Tashi Lama. Tibetans call him Tsang Peshin Rinpoche, the precious learned man of the province of Tsang, Tsang. He is considered to be an emanation of Odpagmed, Odpagmed, the mystic Buddha of infinite light, and at the same time a reincarnation of Subhuti, Subhuti, one of the foremost disciples of the historical Buddha. From a spiritual point of view, his rank equals that of the Dalai Lama, but as spirit in this world must often yield precedence to temporal power, so the Dalai Lama, autocrat of Tibet, is the master. Foreseeing the possible consequences of this journey, I put off starting for Chigatse until I was definitely ready to leave the Himalayas. I went from my hermitage to Chorten Nyima, Chortennyima, where I had stayed before, and from there I left for Chigatse, accompanied by Yongden and a monk who was to act as our servant. We were all three on horseback. Our luggage was placed in large leather saddlebags, as is custom in Tibet. A pack mule carried 2 small tents and our provisions. The distance was not great. One could easily accomplish the trip in 4 days. I intended, however, to travel very slowly so as not to miss anything of interest on the way, and above all that I might absorb in body and spirit as much as possible of Tibet, whose heart I was at last about to penetrate, but probably might never see again. Since my visit to Chorten Nyima, I had met a son of the Lama sorcerer who sent ritualistic cakes flying through the air to punish his disobedient neighbors, and I had been invited, if circumstances permitted, to visit him. Tranglung, Tranglung, the village where he lived, was no more on the straight road leading from my hermitage to Chigatse than Chorten Nyima. But, as I have just said, I intended to profit by all opportunities of seeing interesting things that my adventure in forbidden land might bring me. We reached Travelogue at the end of the afternoon. The village was quite different from any other that Tibetan settlers had built in the Himalayas. It was indeed surprising to find such a complete contrast at so short a distance. Not only the tall stone houses differed from the cottages made of wood with thatched roofs that I had been accustomed to seeing in Sikkim, but the climate, the soil, the landscape, the people, cast of features and general look had changed. I was really in Tibet. We found the sorcerer in his oratory, a large room without any windows, scantily enough lighted through the roof. Near him were several men to whom he was distributing charms which consisted in toys like small pigs' heads made of pink-colored clay wrapped in woolen threads of different shades. The peasants listened with rapt attention to their lama's endless instructions on the ways to use these objects. When they had gone, the householder lama, with a gracious smile, invited me to take tea with him. A long conversation ensued. I was burning to ask my host about the flying cakes, but a direct question would have been against all rules of politeness. During the few days that I remained there, I was told about a peculiar domestic drama and had the rare honor of being consulted by an authentic sorcerer. Here, in the large number of families in central Tibet, polyandry was practiced. On the wedding day of the Lama's eldest son, his brothers' names had been mentioned in the marriage deed, and the young girl had consented to take them all as husbands. As in most cases at that time, some of the bridegrooms were mere children, who had, of course, not been consulted. They were nevertheless legally married. Now the sorcerer of Travelogue had 4 sons. I was not told that the second son I was not told what the second son thought about his partnership with the elder brother. He was away on journey, and most likely all was right with him. The third son, whom I knew personally, was also traveling somewhere. It was he who had upset the peace of the family. He was much younger than his 2 older brothers, being only 25, and he obstinately refused to fulfill his conjugal duties toward the collective wife. Unfortunately for the lady, this purely nominal husband was far more attractive than the elder 2. Not only was he better looking than his brothers, but he surpassed them in social position, eloquence, learning, and maybe of various other accomplishments that I could not discover. While the 2 elders were but wealthy farmers, the third brother enjoyed the prestige attached in Tibet to clergy. He was a lama, and more than a common lama, he was a so-called Naljorpa, Naljorpa, initiated in occult doctrines. He had the right to wear the 5-sided hat of the tantric mystics and the white skirt of the Respas, Respas, who are adepts in tumo, Tumo, the art of keeping warm without fire, even in the coldest weather. It was this distinguished husband who refused to fulfill his part, and the offended wife could not resign herself to be disdained. What made the matter worse was that the young lama courted a girl in one of the neighboring villages and meant to marry her. The law of the country permitted him to do so, but if he persisted in this marriage and thus broke up the unity of the family, the young husband would have to leave his father's home and establish a new home for his bride. The priestly son of my host did not shrink from the responsibility and even relied confidently on his earnings as a sorcerer to make that home comfortable. But by so doing, would he not be setting himself up as a rival to his father? Although the old Lama did not express his thoughts in words, I could read in the expression of his face that he feared a competitor in that obstinate son who refused to please a healthy, sturdy woman of 40, probably not too ugly. I could not dispute this point, for the wife's features were hidden under a thick coating of butter and soot that made her as black as a negress. "What on earth is to be done?" groaned the aged mother of the family. I had no experience in such matters, though I had met polyandrous ladies in the West. As a rule, no family council was called in to settle the imbroglios that result from their affairs, and in my travels I had only been asked for advice by polygamist gentlemen whose homes had become a seat of war. Since polygamy is also legal in Tibet, I suggested that the young Lama might be persuaded to bring his bride home. Lucky for me, I was then wearing the respected monastic robe, for only this prevented the jealous, disdained wife from throwing herself upon me. "Reverend lady," cried the old mother as she wept, "you do not know that our daughter-in-law wanted to send her servants to beat the girl and to disfigure her. We had a hard task to prevent her from doing so. Think of people of our rank doing such things. We should be dishonored forever afterwards." I could find nothing more to say, so I remarked it was time for my evening meditation, and I asked permission to retire to the oratory which the Lama had courteously lent me for the night. As I was leaving the room, I noticed the youngest son, a lad of 18, the husband number 4. He was seated in a dark corner, looking at the common wife with a strange half-smile, as if he were saying, "Wait a little, old lady. I have worse things in store for you." During the following days, I wandered idly from village to village, sleeping at night in the peasants' houses. I did not try to hide my identity, as I was obliged to later on the road to Lhasa. No one here seemed to notice that I was a foreigner, or at least no one seemed to attach any importance to that fact. My road passed the monastery of Patur, Patur, which appeared to me immense compared with those of Sikkim. One of the ecclesiastic officials invited us to an excellent meal in a dark hall where we enjoyed the company of several monks. Nothing there, with the exception of the massive building several stories high, was entirely new to me. Nevertheless, I understood that Lamaism as I had observed it in Sikkim was only a pale reflection of that which exists in Tibet. I had vaguely imagined that beyond the Himalayas the country would become wild, but now I began to realize that, on the contrary, I was coming into touch with a truly civilized people. Among the various incidents of the journey, the Chi River, Chi River, swollen by the rains and melting snows, was difficult to ford, in spite of the help of 3 villagers who took our horses across one by one. Beyond the village, called Kuma, extends a long tract of desert land. According to the description of our servant, who knew the road well, I hoped to camp pleasantly near thermal springs, getting a hot bath and warm earth for bedding. A sudden storm compelled us to set up our camp hastily before reaching the desired paradise. First hail attacked us, and then snow began to fall so hard that it soon came nearly up to our knees. A neighboring brook overflowed into our camp. I had to spend the night fasting and standing up most of the time on a small island that was the only spot under my tent not invaded by the muddy water. So much for the comfortable sleep that I had expected. At last, at a turning of the road where I had stopped to look at a drunken man wallowing in the dust, my eyes suddenly fell on a glorious vision. In the bluish gloaming, excuse me, in the bluish gloaming, the enormous monastery of Talshilhumpu stood in the distance, a mass of white buildings, crowned with golden roofs that reflected the last dim rays of the setting sun. I had reached my goal. A sudden idea had grown up in my mind. Instead of looking for a shelter in one of the inns of the town, I sent my servant to the Lama, who was responsible for entertaining the monks' visitors or the native students from the Kham province, Kham. How could a foreign woman traveler, unknown to him, awaken his interest, and what reason would she have for requesting his good offices? I had not asked myself this question. I acted entirely on impulse, and the result was excellent. The distinguished official sent a trappa to order 2 rooms for me in the only house next to the monastery. There I settled myself. The very next day, according to the protocol, the requests for an audience with the Tashi Lama were begun. I had to give details of my native country and satisfy them by saying that my birthplace was called Paris. Which Paris? South of Lhasa, there's a village called Phagri, Pagri, the name being pronounced Paris. I explained that my Paris was a little farther away from the Tibetan capital and stood westward, but I insisted on the point that starting from Tibet, one could reach my country without crossing the sea, and that, consequently, I was not a filling, in brackets, stranger. Filling spelled Philling. This was a play upon the word filling, Philling, which literally means a continent over sea. I had stayed so long in the proximity of Shigatse that it was impossible to be unknown there, and moreover, the fact of having lived as a hermit made me somewhat famous in the country. An audience was immediately granted, and the mother of the Tashi Lama invited me to be her guest. I went over every corner of the monastery, and, to pay for my welcome, I offered tea to the several thousand monks living there. The number of years that had elapsed, and the chances I have taken since that time to visit the large lamaseries, or even dwell in them, have dulled my impressions. But when I went round Tashihumpu, I was deeply struck by everything I saw. A barbaric splendor reigned in the temples, halls, and palaces of the dignitaries. No description can give an idea of it. Gold, silver, turquoises, jade were lavishly used in the altars and tombs, the ornamented doors, the ritualistic implements, and even on mere household objects for the use of the wealthy lamas. Should I say that I admired this opulent display? No, for it seemed unrefined and childish, the work of powerful giants whose minds had not grown up. That first contact with Tibet would even have impressed me unfavorably if I had not ever been present before me the vision of its calm solitudes, and known that they conceal ascetic sages who spurn the vulgarities that are the insignia of grandeur in the eyes of the masses. The Tashi Lama was most kind to me. Every time I saw him, showered me with his attentions. He knew quite well where my Paris was, and pronounced the word France with a perfect French accent. My zeal for the study of Lamaism pleased him very much. He was willing to help me in my researches in any way. Why should I not stay in Tibet, he asked me. Why indeed? Desire was not lacking, but I knew that however great and honored he was in the country, the gracious Grand Lama had not enough temporal power to obtain permission for me to live in Tibet. Nevertheless, if I had, at that moment, been as free of ties as I was when I undertook my journey to Lhasa, I might have attempted to avail myself in some secluded spot of the protection which was offered to me, but I had not foreseen such an offer. My luggage, notes, collections of negative photos, why should one think these things are important, had been left behind in the care of some friends in Calcutta, others in my hermitage. How many things remained for me to learn? How great was my mental transformation necessary to enable me to become, a few years later, a joyful tramp in the wilds of Tibet. While at Shigatse, I met the masters who had educated the Tashi Lama, his professor of secular sciences, and he who had initiated him into mystic doctrines. I also came to know a contemplative mystic, the spiritual guide of the Tashi Lama, a highly revered by him, who, if we must believe the stories told about him, ended his life a few years later in a miraculous way. During my visit to Shigatse, the temple that the Tashi Lama meant to dedicate to the future Buddha Maitreya, the Lord of infinite compassion, was nearing completion. I saw the huge image placed in a hall with galleries that allowed the devotees to circle around it on the ground floor, on a level with the feet, and successively ascending the first, second, and third galleries, up to its belt, its shoulders, and its head. 20 jewelers were setting the enormous ornaments that were to adorn the gigantic Maitreya. They were resetting the jewels presented by the ladies belonging to the nobility of Tsang, the mother of the Tashi Lama, at their head, with the gift of all her sets of precious stones. I spent delightful days in the palaces of the Tashi Lama in Shigatse and the neighborhood. I talked with men of widely different characters. The novelty of what I saw and heard, the special psychic atmosphere of the place enchanted me. I have seldom enjoyed such blissful hours. At last, the dreaded moment came. Taking with me books, notes, presents, and the robe of a graduate Lama that the Tashi Lama had bestowed on me as a kind of diploma of doctor honorary causa of the Tashilhunpo University, I left Shigatse, gazing sadly at the immense monastery as it disappeared behind the same turning of the road from which it had first appeared to me. I went on to Narthang, Narthang, to visit the largest of the printing establishments in Tibet. The number of engraved wooden plates used for the printing of the various religious books was prodigious. Set up on shelves in rows, they filled a huge building. The printers, spattered with ink up to their elbows, sat on the floor as they worked, while in the other rooms, monks cut the paper according to the size required for each kind of book. There was no haste. Chatting and drinking of buttered tea went on freely. What a contrast to the feverish agitation in our newspaper printing rooms. From Northang, I sought out the hermitage of a Gomchen, who had been good enough to send me an invitation. I found the anchorites' abode in a desolate place on a hill near the lake Motitong, Mo-Te-Tong. It consisted of a spacious cave to which one room after another had been added till it looked like a small fort. The present Gomchen had succeeded his master, who himself had succeeded his own spiritual father, famous as a wonder worker. Gifts of devotees to 3 generations of Lama magicians had led to the accumulation in the hermitage of a good number of objects affording comfort, and life could be passed there quite pleasantly, that is, from the point of view of a Tibetan, born in the wilds and accustomed since his youth to live as the disciple of an anchorite. Such was the case of my host. He had never been to Lhasa, nor to Chigasi, nor traveled anywhere in Tibet, and knew nothing of the world outside his cave. His master had lived there for more than 30 years, and when he died, the present hermit had walled himself in. But by walled in, one must understand that one door only gave access to the hermitage enclosure, and this door the Lama never approached. 2 lower rooms under the rock, kitchen, storeroom, and servants' quarter were altogether opened on an inner courtyard, closed in on one side, which gave onto the precipice by a high wall. Above these rooms, an upper cave, was a private apartment for the Lama, which was reached by a ladder and a trapdoor in the floor. This chamber stood on a small terrace, also closed by walls, so the recluse could take a little exercise or sun himself without being seen by anyone outside, and without himself seeing anything but the sky overhead. The anchorite mitigated the severity of his seclusion by receiving visitors and chatting with them, but he added to his austerity by never lying down to sleep, spending the nights in a gamti, Gamti. There exist in Tibet special seats which are called gamti, box seat, or gomti, Gomti, meditation seat. These are square boxes, each side being about 25 or 30 inches long, one of the sides being higher to form the back of the seat. At the bottom of the box is a cushion, which is placed... Let me start the sentence over again. At the bottom of the box, a cushion is placed on which the ascetic sits cross-legged. Often he does not allow himself to lie back against the back of the seat, and in order to support his body, either while sleeping or during long meditation, he uses the meditation rope, in brackets, Sgomchag, Sgomthag. It is a sash, usually made in woolen cloth, which one passes under the knees and behind the nape of the neck, or with which one encircles the knees and the back. Many Gomchins spend days and nights in that way, without reclining or stretching their limbs to sleep. They doze sometimes, but they never fall fast asleep, and except during these short periods of drowsiness, they do not stop their meditation. I had several interesting conversations with the hermit, and then I turned back toward the frontier. The British resident at Gomtok had already sent a letter by presents. The British resident at Gomtok had already sent a letter by peasants from Sikkim ordering me to leave Tibetan soil. I had not obeyed because I wanted to end my trip as I had planned it, but now I had accomplished my object, and as I had foreseen the consequences of a prolonged incursion on the forbidden territory, I was ready to bid farewell to the Himalayas. A second letter commanding me to leave the vicinity of the Tibetan border found me already on the road to India, en route for the Far East. And that concludes that chapter 2. And chapter 3 is called A Famous Tibetan Monastery.